Chapter 1. The Fabric of a Life. In the small sun-dusted town of Sparrow Creek, life was woven from simple sturdy threads. The seasons, the church bells, the twice-weekly arrival of the stagecoach, and the quiet, unwavering presence of Clara May Thompson. At 65, Clara was the town's premier dressmaker, a title she had held with gentle authority for over 40 years. Her shop, Thompson's Fine Apparel, was not merely a place of business. It was the town's unofficial parlour, its confessional, its heart. Clara was a woman of serene and meticulous grace. Her silver-streaked hair was always swept into an elegant but practical bun, and her eyes, the soft, warm brown of well-worn leather, held a deep well of kindness and an astute understanding of human nature. Her hands, though beginning to show the fine map of age, were her instruments. They moved with a dancer's precision, guiding a needle through fine silk, or coaxing a difficult seam into submission. The shop itself was her sanctuary, a world of ordered beauty that smelled of fresh linen beeswax and the faint sweet perfume of chamomile tea. She had built a life of respectable quietude, a carefully stitched fortress against the unpredictable sorrows of the world. Her beloved husband, a kind and steady blacksmith named Henry, had been taken by influenza 15 years prior. His loss had been a tear in the very fabric of her existence, one she had painstakingly mended with the threads of routine community and work. She had accepted her lot as a widow, a respected pillar of the town, her days of passion and romance, a treasured but firmly closed chapter of her past. She found her joy in her craft, in the small dramas of her clients, and in the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. Her world was a tapestry of familiar faces and predictable patterns. She knew who needed a new Sunday dress whose son had outgrown his trousers, and whose mourning clothes needed to be let out after a period of grieving. She was content. She believed she knew every thread in the weave of Sparrow Creek. She did not know that a new, strange and darkly beautiful thread was about to be introduced, one that threatened to unravel everything she thought she knew about her town and herself. Chapter 2. The Man of Fire and Shadow. He arrived without fanfare, a quiet man who set up shop in the long-abandoned smithy at the edge of town, the very place Clara's husband had once worked. The sign he hung was simple, carved from a single piece of dark wood, E. Thorne Silversmith. His name was Elias Thorne. He was a man who seemed to be forged from fire and shadow. He was tall and lean, with hair the colour of iron filings shot through with silver, and eyes the startling, intense blue of a gas flame. He was perhaps a few years younger than Clara, but he carried himself with the heavy weariness of a much older soul. His face was a handsome ruin, marked by a thin white scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his jaw, a permanent slash of violence on an otherwise noble canvas. He was a man of few words and profound skill. The town watched curious as he transformed the old smithy. He did not shoe horses or mend ploughs. He worked with silver. From the quiet inferno of his forge, he created objects of breathtaking beauty, delicate filigree earrings, sturdy belt buckles inlaid with turquoise and intricate silver crosses that seemed to hold a light of their own. His hands, though large and scarred, moved with a surgeon's precision. But he kept himself apart. He was polite when he came into town for supplies, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, but he offered no personal information. He did not attend church. He did not linger at the general store for idle gossip. He would collect his necessities and retreat to his forge, The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his small hammer, the only communication he seemed willing to have with the world. The town naturally was alive with speculation. He was a wanted man, some said. A former gunslinger, others whispered, pointing to the scar and the coiled, watchful stillness he possessed. Clara, from the window of her shop, would sometimes watch him walk down the street, and she felt not fear, but a strange, deep-running current of curiosity. She was a woman who understood the language of mending things, and she saw in him a man who was profoundly, beautifully broken. Their first real interaction was mundane. The clasp on her favourite silver locket, a gift from Henry, had broken. With a sigh of resignation, she knew there was only one man in town who could fix it. She walked to the edge of town, the familiar path to the smithy, feeling strange and new. She found him at his workbench, surrounded by his tools, the air smelling of hot metal and charcoal. He looked up as she entered, his blue eyes intense, guarded. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice calm and even. "I have a small repair if you have the time." She placed the locket on his workbench. He picked it up, his scarred fingers surprisingly gentle. He examined the broken clasp for a long moment. It was well made, he said, his voice the first sound to break the silence. "My husband made it for me," she replied softly. He looked up at her then, and for a fleeting second, the guard in his eyes dropped, revealing a deep, aching loneliness that resonated with her own. "I can fix it," he said. "Come back tomorrow." The brief exchange left Clara feeling unsettled. The air in his forge had been charged with an energy she hadn't felt in years, a mixture of danger and a strange, compelling sadness. She returned to her own quiet, orderly world, but found her mind drifting back to the man of fire and shadow, the keeper of the quiet forge at the edge of her peaceful town. Chapter 3. The Unravelling of a Seam. Clara returned the next day to find her locket repaired, the work so seamless she could not find the join. It was stronger than it had been before. "What do I owe you, Mr. Thorne?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, not meeting her eyes. It was an honour to work on a piece contact with. Elias took the locket to his workbench, fitting a jeweller's loop to his eye. The craftsmanship was intricate, delicate. He turned it over and found the maker's mark, a small, stylized ET entwined with a willow branch. His breath caught. "I know this mark," he said, his voice softer, made with such care. This small, unexpected kindness was a stitch that began to unravel the neat seam of Clara's composure. She found herself inventing reasons to walk by his smithy, catching a glimpse of him at his work, lost in the focused alchemy of his craft. She began leaving a small loaf of fresh bread on his doorstep in the mornings, a silent offering that was always gone by the time she passed again. One evening, as a cold autumn rain began to fall, she saw that he was still working the glow of his forge, a warm beacon in the gathering dusk. On impulse, she put a hearty beef stew into a basket, along with a loaf of her best sourdough, and walked through the rain to his door. She knocked. After a long moment, he opened it, his surprise evident. "Mrs. Thompson," he said than before. "It is mine." Clara's eyes widened in surprise. "You made this?" Elias studied the piece, his memory sifting through a half-century of work. He remembered every significant piece he'd ever made. But this one, it was a ghost. "I recognize my mark, and I recognize my style of work from many years ago, but I have absolutely no memory of creating this locket." The mystery was no longer just hers. It was now his. A piece of his own past, a piece of his own handswork, was lost to his memory. It was a dissonant note in his perfectly ordered world. The botanist who owned this, Clara said, sensing his intrigue, he was searching for a very rare flower, a flower with petals like silver. The locket seems to be connected to his quest. Perhaps if we find the place he was describing it, his voice rough. You shouldn't be out in this weather, and you shouldn't be working on an empty might jog your memory. She was inviting him on a journey not just into the mountains, but into his own forgotten stomach, she countered, holding out the basket. It is not good for a person to be so alone, Mr. Thorne passed. Elias, a man who had not ventured far from his forge in 40 years, felt a stir of something he hadn't felt in a lifetime, a deep, unsettling curiosity. I am not a man of the mountains anymore. He hesitated, then stepped back, allowing her to enter. The inside of his small living quarters was Spartan, Mrs. Lowell. He said more to himself than to her. But you are a man who knows this, but impeccably clean. A single cot, a table, a chair, and a shelf of well-worn books. He took the basket from her, his usual guarded expression softening into something like gratitude. No one has done land, she countered gently, and you are the only one who can unlock the first part of this mystery. I am simply this for me in a very long time, he said quietly. They ate together at his small table, the sound trying to finish another man's work. It seems, sir, that you are too. He looked from the locket in his hand to the intelligent, patient eyes of the woman before him. Against his better judgment, against of the rain drumming on the roof, a gentle percussion to their quiet companionship. He was still a man of few words, but in the quiet, safe habits of a lifetime, he heard himself say, "When do we leave?" Chapter 3. The Trail of Memory. Their journey began 2 days later. It was an odd partnership. Elias, the quiet, the warmth of the small room, he seemed to relax. He asked her about her shop, about her late husband. She in turn dared to ask about his craft. Why silver, she asked. He looked at his scarred hands. Because it's honest, he said after a long pause. You can't lie to it. It, craftsman rooted in his town, and Clara the articulate scientist at home in the wilderness. He was a man who looked down, studying the secrets of metal and stone. She was a woman who looked around, studying the secrets of leaf, takes what it is hard, cold, unyielding, and with enough fire and pressure and patience you can make and petal. They travelled on horseback, with a pack mule carrying their supplies. The trail led them away from the gentle it into something beautiful, something new. It's a hopeful metal. In that moment, Clara understood. His rolling hills around Sparrow Creek and into the rugged, broken country of the high peaks. The silence between them was at work, was not a trade. It was a form of penance, a form of prayer. He was not just shaping first awkward, filled only with the plodding of hooves and the sigh of the wind, but the land itself became silver. He was trying to reshape himself. A deep, powerful wave of empathy washed over her, and with it, something their common language. Elias, despite his long absence from the wild, found his old knowledge returning. He knew the safe else something warmer and more dangerous affection. When she left that night, he walked her to her door with a lantern places to cross a creek, the signs of an approaching storm. The way the rocks told a story of geological time. Clara, the circle of light, creating a small, intimate world for them in the rainy darkness. At her doorstep, he paused. "My name is Elias," he said softly. "I know," she replied, a small smile touching her lips. In turn, read the landscape in a different way. She would point out a patch of Indian paintbrush, explaining its medicinal properties. She would identify the call of a canyon wren. She gave names to the things Elias had only ever seen as part of a silent, anonymous background. In the evenings, they would make camp. By the warm glow of a campfire, "Good night, Elias." It was the beginning of something, a fragile, tentative friendship blooming in the autumn of their lives. It was a quiet, comfortable rhythm. Her morning bread, his occasional gruffly offered repairs, and under a canopy of stars more brilliant than any polished silver, their own stories began to emerge. Elias, hesitant at first, spoke of his Sarah. He did not speak of the tragedy of her death, but of the joy of her life, their shared, silent understanding of what it meant to be alone. Clara found herself feeling a lightness she hadn't experienced in her laugh. The way she loved the taste of wild strawberries, the small silver bluebird he had made for her on their first anniversary. Speaking of her to this kind, attentive stranger did not feel like a betrayal. It felt like an act years. But she, a woman who understood patterns, should have known that quiet rhythms are often the prelude to a storm. Of remembrance of giving her memory air to breathe, Clara in turn shared her own story. She spoke. Chapter 4. A Shadow from the Past. The storm arrived as they so often do in a sealed envelope. It was a letter that came on the noon stagecoach addressed simply to E. Thorne Blacksmith, of a youthful engagement to a good man in Philadelphia, a man who had wanted to give her a comfortable life, a home, a Clara in her official capacity as postmistress by default. The actual postmaster, being a feckless drunk, held the letter in her hand. The return address was from the territorial prison at Yuma. A cold dread washed family. He was a fine man, she said, staring into the flames. But he wanted me to be over her. She knew with a woman's intuition that was surer than any fact that this letter was a harbinger, the queen of his parlour. And I wanted to be a student of the world. He saw my passion for botany as a hobby to be put aside after marriage. I knew in my heart that it was not a hobby. It was my life of trouble. She debated for a moment, then placed it with Elias's other mail. It was not her place to interfere. When he came to collect his mail later that day, she watched as he saw the letter. His. To give it up would have been a kind of death. She had made a difficult choice, a choice that her brought entire body went still. The weary peace he had begun to find seemed to evaporate, replaced by the coiled, dangerous stillness, her a life of adventure and intellectual fulfillment, but also one of quiet, persistent loneliness. Elias listened, and for the first time he saw a reflection of his own solitude in another person. They were both alone, but for entirely she had seen when he first arrived. He took the letter without a word and left his shoulders set in a hard, different reasons. He, because love had been taken from him. She, because she had chosen a different kind of love. Rigid line. For the next week, he was a ghost. Her morning bread remained untouched on his doorstep. The forge. It seems, he said softly, looking up at the vast star-dusted sky that we have, was cold and silent. The light in his window was extinguished. He had retreated back into the fortress of his solitude, and both spent our lives navigating by a single fixed point. For me, it was a memory. For you, it. Clara's heart ached with a sense of loss that was sharp and painful. Finally, unable to bear the silence, was a purpose. The wall between them was dissolving, replaced by a bridge of shared understanding and a deep growing. She went to him. She found him sitting in his darkened smithy, a bottle of whiskey on the bench beside him, his respect. Chapter 4. The Canyon of the Silver Bell. Following the cryptic clues in Dr. Finch's journal, they finally found the place he had described, a hidden narrow canyon, its entrance shielded by a thick grove face, a mask of grim despair. "Elias," she said softly, entering the shadows. "Talk to me of aspen trees." They entered and the world changed. The air was cooler, the light softer, filtered through the leaves. He looked up, his blue eyes clouded with pain. "You should stay away from me, Clara," he said, his voice rough. "I am not a good man. I bring trouble. Trouble has a way of finding us." A small, clear stream trickled over moss-covered rocks. The canyon walls were covered in a lush tapestry of ferns and wildflowers, unlike any they had seen in the outer mountains. It was a world apart, a secret garden, created by nature itself. They found the remains of Finch's last camp, a rusted tin cup. "The charred circle of a long all good or bad," she replied, sitting on a stool opposite him. "You don't have to face it alone." He was silent for a long time. Then the story came pouring out of him, a torrent of words held back for years. His name was Elias Thorne, yes. But he had not always been a silversmith. He dead fire, a leather-bound book half buried in the leaves. It was his specimen book. Clara opened it with reverent hands. Inside were a dozen pressed flowers, all of them the same ethereal silver-petaled bell had been a U.S. Marshal. One of the best and one of the most feared. The scar on his face flower. But the living plants were nowhere to be found. He must have collected all the specimens he could find. Clara said was a souvenir from a knife fight with a border bandit. His hands were scarred, not just from the forge, but from her voice filled with disappointment. Perhaps the patch was very small. Perhaps it's gone forever. The quest lifetime of violence. He had quit the service 5 years ago after a final brutal shootout that had left two seemed to have reached a dead end. The mystery of the locket remained unsolved. That evening, their campfire conversation was more innocent bystanders dead. The guilt had broken him. He had laid down his guns, wandered for years, and finally found his subdued. The easy companionship of the trail was replaced by a sense of shared failure. Later that night, unable to sleep, Elias wayed to Sparrow Creek, hoping to build a new life, a peaceful life with his hands. He was trying to create, sat by the dying embers of the fire, the broken locket in his hand. He had failed. He had not beauty to atone for the ugliness he had caused. The letter was from the warden at Yuma Prison. It was a professional courtesy. An old enemy, a ruthless gang leader named Black Jack Corrigan, was being released. Corrigan was a man Elias had personally hunted down and sent to prison for life. He had sworn a blood oath that he would be able to recover the lost piece of his own history. He ran his thumb over the dented silver, feeling the familiar weight of one day find Elias Thorne and destroy everything he held dear. "He knows I'm here," Elias said, his voice a dead monotone. "He has eyes everywhere. He'll come, and when he does, he will burn it." His craftsman's hands, acting on instinct, began to probe the intricate scrollwork around the edges. He felt a tiny, almost imperceptible seam. It was not a flaw. It was a mechanism. "With the tip this down to the ground just to watch me suffer." Clara listened, her heart aching for the terrible weight he carried of a small knife he carefully worked at the seam. there was a soft click and a hidden compartment. One he had no memory of creating sprang open. "Clara," he called out softly. She came from her bed. She saw it all now, the haunted eyes, the coiled stillness, the self-imposed isolation. It was all a desperate roll, her face questioning in the dim firelight. He showed her the open locket. Inside, there was no space attempt to protect others from the violence of his past. "So you will just sit here and wait for him for a portrait." Instead, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single exquisitely pressed and preserved silver bellflower, she asked. "I will face him when he comes," he said, "but I will face him alone." And beneath it, a tiny folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, Elias unfolded it. "The note will not have you or this town caught in the crossfire. You must stay away from me, Clara, for your own safety." Clara stood up, her quiet demeanour, replaced by a fierce, unshakable strength that surprised them, was not from Dr. Finch. The handwriting was a delicate feminine script. It read, "For the both. I have lived in this town my entire life. Elias Thorne," she said, her voice ringing in man, "who sees the beauty in small forgotten things. May this guide your heart as the North Star guides your path. The quiet smithy. I have buried a husband here. I have built a life here. I am not some may you find what you seek. With deepest admiration, L.M." Elias stared at the initials. "Damsel in distress to be protected. I am a citizen of this community, and you are a part of this community now, whether you like it or not. Your trouble is our trouble, and you will not face it alone." She reached out and took L.M., and then, like a photograph developing slowly in a chemical bath, the memory emerged from the fog of 40 years. L.M. Laura May, his wife Sarah's younger sister, a shy, quiet, bookish girl who had adored the whiskey bottle from his bench. "This will not help," she said, setting it aside. "But I will. Go, Sarah," and had looked at Elias with a silent, hero-worshipping gaze. She had died of consumption just a year after Sarah's passing. He remembered her visiting his shop, watching him work for hours. He remembered her asking him home, "Bathe, eat the food I will bring you, and tomorrow we will think." Not as a lone marshal, but as neighbours. Elias stared at her, a flicker of disbelief, and then a profound weary to teach her some basic silver-working techniques. And he remembered vaguely helping her craft a special secret project, a locket, a gift for someone she admired but was too shy to speak to. A visiting botanist who had been kind gratitude in his eyes. For the first time, he was not just seeing a kind woman. He was seeing a formidable ally. He had tried to push her away to protect her, but she had refused to be pushed. She had claimed him and his trouble as her own. Chapter 5. Forging a plan. The news to her. The locket was not his memory to have, it was hers. It was a secret, unrequited love story, a quiet, hopeful message she had never had the courage to deliver in person. Dr. Finch must have Corrigan's impending arrival cast a pall of fear over Sparrow Creek. Elias, at Clara's insistence, had her found it among her things after she passed a poignant memento of the quiet girl who had admired him. The mystery was solved. And in its solving, a great weight lifted from Elias's soul. This ghost from the past was informed the town's young, inexperienced sheriff, a good-hearted but overwhelmed boy named Billy. The town council held a panicked meeting. There was talk of forming a militia, of sending for help from the territorial capital. But help was weeks, not a betrayal of his love for Sarah. It was a gentle, touching postscript, a story of another's heart away, Corrigan could arrive at any time. Elias, however, was a changed man. Clara's unwavering. Chapter 5. A different kind of map. They rode back to Sparrow Creek the next day. Support had broken through his wall of solitary guilt. He was no longer just waiting for a fight. He was thinking. The purpose of their journey was complete, but a new unspoken question hung in the air between them. Their partnership marshal again, but a different kind. He was thinking not just about how to win, but about how to protect. He and Clara spent the evenings in her cozy parlor, a strange but effective council of war. He would pay spawn of a shared quest was now over. What would come next? Clara's work in the region, his mind working through tactics and strategies, the mind of a hunter. She would sit her hands busy with her sewing was done. She began to pack her botanical presses and her journals, preparing to move on to her next destination. Her mind working through the threads of community, the strengths and weaknesses of the people they needed to protect. Core next blank space on her life's map. Elias watched her, his own workshop feeling quieter, emptier than ever. Egan is not a fool, Elias said one night staring into the fire. He won't just ride in before. The thought of her leaving left an ache in his chest that was frighteningly familiar. He had spent 40 with guns blazing. That's not his style. He's a sadist. He will terrorize the town first. He'll make the people turn on me. He wants to isolate me, make me suffer, before he makes years building walls to protect himself from this very feeling. But the days spent with her in the mountains had without his realizing his move. Then we must not be isolated, Clara said simply, not looking up from her mending. If it dismantled them stone by stone, her intelligence, her independence, her quiet passion for the world they had he tries to break one thread, he must find it woven into a strong cloth. Her simple words sparked an idea, awakened a part of him he had thought long dead. He knew he was standing at a crossroads. He could retreat back into the safe, polished solitude of his workshop, or he could take the greatest risk of his life. The morning Elias's mind. He couldn't outgun Corrigan's gang, not alone. But perhaps he could outman. She was scheduled to leave. He went to the boarding house where she was staying. He found her in the parlor, her bags packed and waiting by the door. He held a small cloth-wrapped object in his hand. I am over them. He knew Corrigan's weakness, his arrogance, his love of theatrical cruelty. He began to formulate a plan, poor man with words, Clara. He began his voice a little unsteady. My hands have always spoken for me, not of open warfare, but of strategic defense, a plan that would use the town's own layout and its people as a fortress. He went to the men of the town. He did not ask them to be gunslingers. He unwrapped the object. It was a compass. But it was unlike any she had ever seen. The casing, he gave them specific practical tasks. He had the blacksmith barricade the ends of the main street, creating a bottleneck. He organized a system of lookouts on the high ridges. He had every man clean his rifle. Not for was made of polished silver, and he had engraved the directions not with NSE and W, but with 4 tiny intricate symbols, a mountain, a river, a star, and a single perfect silver shade bell. Shootout, but for a show of unified strength. Clara meanwhile rallied the women. She organized them to, "You are a woman who navigates the world," he said, placing it in her hand. I thought stockpile food, water and medical supplies in the church cellar. She established a system for caring for the children. She turned the "you should have a compass that speaks your language." The mountain so you remember your strength. The river so you remember to follow your own course. The star for your purpose. And the flower? She asked softly, her eyes shining community's fear into purposeful action. Her quiet strength was the loom upon which Elias wove his strategy. In the flower, he said, his gaze meeting hers, full of a quiet, profound hope. So the midst of this tense preparation, their own bond deepened. They found a profound comfort in each other's presence. He admired her quiet, unshakable courage. She admired his brilliant strategic mind now turned to the purpose of protection. You always know the way back. Clara looked from the beautiful, deeply personal gift in her hand to the face instead of vengeance. One evening, as they stood on her porch watching the sunset, a fragile peace settled over them of the kind, solitary man before her. She had spent her life choosing the freedom of the journey over the confines of a destination. I am afraid, Clara. He admitted, his voice low. I know, she said, placing. But looking at Elias, she realized for the first time that home was not a place you were confined to, but a hand on his arm. But being afraid and being alone are two different things. He turned to her, the dying light softening the scar on his face. He looked at her, at this incredible woman who had seen the broken parts, a person you chose to return to. She did not leave on the noon stagecoach. Chapter 6. The Silver and the Bloom. The seasons turned. Clara Lowell did not give up her journeys. She would leave of him and had not turned away. He leaned in and gently, hesitantly kissed her. It was not a kiss of fiery passion, but one of deep, profound tenderness. It was a kiss that tasted of gratitude, of shared fear for weeks at a time, exploring new valleys, cataloguing new species. But she always came back. The silver compass always led her home. The shop on the corner of Main and Willow was no longer the sole domain of Elias Thorne. It of a love that had taken a lifetime to arrive. In that moment, Clara May Thompson's carefully stitched world was now a place of two quiet, harmonious worlds. On one side was the scent of metal and polish. On the other was irrevocably, beautifully and terrifyingly altered. She was no longer just a spectator to life's great passions. She was the scent of pressed flowers and drying herbs. The maps on the wall now depicted not just property lines, but the migratory, at the very heart of one. Chapter 6. The Arrival. Blackjack Corrigan and his 5 paths of birds. The silverwork on the counter included not just buckles and rings, but exquisite, botanically perfect recremen rode into Sparrow Creek, not at dawn, but in the middle of a peaceful Tuesday afternoon. They did not gallop. Ations of wildflowers. Theirs was not a fiery, youthful passion. It was a deeper, quieter love. A companionship built on a foundation of shared solitude and mutual respect. It was the love of two people who had lived full, separate lives, and they walked their horses slowly down the main street, their presence a deliberate, menacing stain on the town's tranquility. Corrigan was a big man, with a florid face and eyes as cold and dead as a snake's. He saw the barrack had now chosen to gently, carefully map a new world together. One evening, as they sat by the fire in Elias's parlour, Clara was reading from one of her journals, and Elias was polishing a simple silver band. Headies. He saw the watchful eyes in the windows. He saw Elias Thorne standing alone in the middle of the street waiting for him. Corrigan smiled a cruel, unpleasant expression. This was exactly the kind of theatrical confrontation he loved, stopped his work, and looked at her, his heart full. I spent my whole life creating permanence from a precious metal, he said. And you spent yours celebrating the fleeting beauty of a season's bloom. Clara looked up from her book. Thorn, he boomed, his voice echoing in the silent street. I told you I would find you. I've come to collect my due. 15 years of my life. I think your town is a fair price. And smiled. And now she said, her voice full of a quiet, contented joy, we have both. The town is not for sale. Corrigan Elias said, his voice calm and steady. He was not wearing the silver and the bloom, the memory and the moment. It is, I think, a perfect map. And in the A gun belt. His hands were empty at his sides. This surprised Corrigan. No gun marshal. Have you gone soft in your old age? I'm not a marshal anymore, Elias said. I'm a silversmith, and this is my home. From the window of her shop, Clara watched her heart in quiet heart of Sparrow Creek. The silversmith and the botanist, two souls who had found each other in the autumn of their lives, had discovered that the most precious journeys are not the ones that take you far away, but the ones her throat. She saw the tense standoff. She saw Corrigan's men, their hands hovering over their pistols. But she also saw something else. On the rooftops behind the barricades, she saw the silent, determined faces of the men of Sparrow Creek, their rifles held ready, not as an offensive force, but as a silent, unified statement. You are not facing one man. You are facing all of us. Corrigan saw it too. His smile faltered. His plan had been to isolate and terrorize, but the town was not cowering. It was standing together, a silent, bristling fortress. A direct assault would be costly, bloody, and not nearly as satisfying as he had hoped. His arrogance, however, would not let him back down. I will have my revenge, Thorn, he snarled. If not today, then tonight. I will burn this pathetic little town to the ground. He and his men turned and rode to the saloon at the end of the street, dismounting to drink and wait for darkness. Chapter 7. A Battle of Wits. As night fell, a new kind of tension gripped the town. They were safe for the moment, but Corrigan's threat hung over them. Elias knew he couldn't keep the entire town on high alert forever. He had to end this, and he had to do it without the bloody gunfight Corrigan craved. He gathered Sheriff Billy and a few of the town's steadiest men. We are not going to fight him, Elias said. We are going to arrest him. Arrest him, Billy stammered. There are 6 of them, and he hasn't broken any laws. Yet. Oh, he has, Elias said, a faint, dangerous smile touching his lips. He pulled out a worn, leather-bound book. This is a that finally leads you home.